Hi everyone, Pastor Fun here. I'm just going to go by that. My name's Ian. It's my first video for, I'm going to say, my YouTube channel. I have zero video editing skills and this is just going to go straight up. So I apologize up front, and if I start doing a lot of videos, I will try to work on that. Trying to figure out where to start. I'm gonna go without any notes on this, but since my channel name is Pastor Fun, I thought with my first video I'd kind of explain where that name came from. Goes back several years. I'm 38 years old, and I think probably my early 20s. I was at a church service with my mom and stepdad, and I can't exactly remember the sermon, but it had something to do with being in sexual bondage. So we're talking pornography, masturbation, sexual sin, that kind of stuff. And I felt really convicted. So after the service, we did like the fellowship time where you're kind of just hanging about, you know, cookies, snacks, that kind of thing. And I really felt convicted inside to go talk to the pastor. So I went and found his office. It was only our second or third time at this church. And I walk in, and there's a woman sitting at the desk. So I introduced myself, and I said, "Hey, is Pastor Scott there?" And she said, "Well, can I ask what? I'm his wife. Can I ask why you're here?" And of course, I didn't want to tell her. This is a strange woman I've never met, and that's, you know, sensitive topic, and it's a woman, so you know, I kind of let on a little bit without really saying much. And she said, "No, go ahead, tell me a little bit." And I said, you know, that the sermon had been convicting, and she kind of got a grin on her face, and she said, "No, he's gone at this thing called a SALTS conference." And she explained what that meant. SALTS is an acronym. It's Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training Seminar. And I don't know what it was, but something instantly clicked. It was have you ever heard the expression, it's a God thing? And I felt like, wow. So I'm here in this office. I heard this sermon, and he must have just had his bags packed. And it's a week-long seminar, and he must have had his bags packed and just jettisoned the building right after church, and he was off to this conference. So he gets back from the conference. Oh, by the way, so I'm getting ahead of myself. So he left off for this conference, and he's there getting the tools he needs to work with people like me. So if you didn't catch that, I had been sexually abused, and I'd done a little bit of reading, so I knew that some of my struggles were, as an adult, were from some of the childhood abuse. And he was getting some of the tools he needed to help me through my problems. So my mind was just blown. So he got back a week later, and if you've ever been to any kind of retreat conference where you get, you know, fuel for things, when you get back, you're just on fire. So he gets back, and I called the church, and I set up a time to meet with him. And he heard my story, and a lot of tears. That man, and if he ever listens to this, helps me through one of the hardest and most difficult and painful obstacles I've ever come across in my life. I met with him, and he introduced me to a book called The Wounded Heart, written by Dr. Dan Allender. And that book opened my eyes and changed my life. The entire premise of the book basically helps you dive into these pains that we've built, emotional barriers against, that protects us, so we don't have to experience the trauma of those wounds ever again. And basically tear them down, feel the pain, heal from the pain and we're free. We met once a week for probably an entire year. So, long story short, I prosecuted a man that sexually abused me for, I want to say, 10 years. On again, off again, kind of a thing. It started at a very young age. I want to say somewhere between 7 and 10 years old. And there was a large psychological aspect to it for me because my parents had divorced, and with the joint custody thing, a lot of times when I was at my father's house, he just wasn't there. And when he was there, he was drunk, or I saw him like using cocaine a lot. There was like hardcore pornography on the TV. So I saw a lot of things a little guy shouldn't have seen. So my idea of what it meant to be a man took a big left turn. And then being at my mom's house, I was always in church. So I learned a really important word that the definition of it kind of grew with me, but it's called ambivalence. So you're torn. So you know one thing's bad, but certain things feel good at the same time. So you're completely torn in half. Almost like being two people. You love it, but you hate it, and you hate that part of yourself, but you love it, and it's a mess, especially as a little kid. But then it creates some real adult problems for you too. Fast forward a little bit, at 18 years old, I felt a strong pull to go into ministry, and part of that was I'd been a Christian at 18 for 6 years. I gave my life to the Lord at 12 years old, and many, many intimate moments with the Lord. However, with the influence from my dad, and I think like many young boys wanting to be like their father, I jumped into that world too. I was smoking pot, marijuana quite a bit. I drank some. I was looking at pornography a lot. But at the same time, loving Jesus. And I'm a theology student, so I know that maybe that doesn't make sense to some people. How could you love Jesus and still do those things? But he never let me go, and I believe the Lord knew that some of the desires of my heart to want to be like my dad were part of being human, and he knew that about me. And him and I have dealt with that. So if you have a problem with that, you can bring it up with him. But kind of moving on from that, so 18, calling to go to Bible college. I had called a school. I would have had to have moved away. And shortly before I would have had to move away, I guess you could say I chickened out. And looking back, I was way too immature. I wasn't through sowing my wild oats, if you will. So I was getting in trouble a lot. I'd been to jail a few times by then. I'd had a DUI by then. Started smoking a lot more pot. Started drinking a lot more. Not so much as an alcoholic, just kind of partying with my friends, and it was a device for me to fit in because I didn't really feel like I belonged anywhere. A little bit further, and as I mentioned, my sexual abuse was at the hands of a man, so I questioned my sexual identity, and because I thought gay was bad, I went after the women really bad, more than I will admit. I carried shame for that for many years. Again, that's something the Lord and I have dealt with. And many of those women I've spoken with, and those relationships are good now. They're not in my life, but there's healing there, I believe, on both sides. And time does have a way of healing wounds in many areas. So, as I mentioned, I'm 38, so I'm trying to remember times, which I'm kind of bad at, but shortly after this time that I mentioned, when I had gone into the pastor's office and we counseled for the year, and I prosecuted the man, I found a new church, and I got introduced to a ministry that does spiritual retreat weekends. And through that ministry and the people I met in it, I started working the spiritual retreat weekends. And meanwhile, kind of a side story, I had started building my own business doing construction, and my shoulder started going bad, and our child had just been born, and my barn burned down all in the same year, and it was pretty chaotic for my small little family. Oh, and we bought a house all in the same year. So I prayed to the Lord. I said, Father, I'm going into this weekend, and I really need you to speak to me. And the nature of these weekends, you're kind of closed off from the world. You don't really have your phone with you, and you're just kind of focused on what the Lord's doing in the lives of the candidates, the people that show up on these weekends. And I asked for him to speak to me, and I kind of focused on that while I wasn't doing my duties for the weekend. And right at the end of the weekend, I kind of closed my eyes in prayers, and it was like neon lights going off in my mind. Be a pastor. And I was mush for the rest of the weekend. And driving home, I got another message, and it said, "You are a pastor." So shortly after that, I went to my church. I was going to a local church in Niles, and I went to my pastor, and I told him about it, and his advice was to go to 3 godly men that would give me an objective opinion on that. I went to 3 men that I knew would be honest with me and not favor me because they liked me. All 3 men affirmed my calling. So I have never been one to hesitate when I know that I know God's saying something. I pull the trigger on it, because faith is a beautiful thing, and when you get a clear direction from God, I say go for it. Don't wait, don't hesitate. It's those times where you're not quite sure what God is saying that kind of stink, and you don't want to do guesswork during those times. That's when I've gotten myself into trouble, as we may find out later, or maybe in some subsequent videos. But so within a week, I was signed up for Bethel College. I didn't know much about the school at the time, but it turned out being really good for me. About a year into my studies, an opening came up at my church, and the pastor called me and said, "Hey, you want a job?" And the Lord hadn't downloaded any, "Ian, I want you to be a senior pastor. Ian, I want you to be a youth pastor." Nothing. But the job opening was for a youth pastor position. I took the job. And the really cool thing about that church was that they really supported, I don't want to say retreats, but maybe like conferences that would enrich your ministry. And lo and behold, a SALTS conference, the same SALTS conference that Pastor Scott had been in, became available. And it was very pricey. $1,200 to be exact. And I brought it up before the board, and they approved it. So I went. I got spoiled with gourmet food for an entire week. And there were some guest speakers a few times, but the bulk of our time was broken down into small group like breakout sessions, I guess you could call them. And we all took turns sharing, and it was facilitated by some wonderful individuals that had been through many, many times, and they were trained facilitators. And we all cried together for a week straight. That was wonderful. And I've talked to counselors a few times in my life, and they've always told me that I'm one of those that need to be worked with rather than worked on. So I'm really resilient to any kind of tactics when people try to get in my head. And I try to carry myself in a way that people don't know what I'm thinking. And maybe that's a defensive mechanism. So I had a little bit of that going on, and not on purpose. That's just, I guess, how I'm wired after years of just junk and garbage. But I remember one of our assignments, we would get assignments, and we'd have to go back to our rooms and work on these assignments. And one of our assignments was writing a letter to our abuser. Well, I had written a letter to my abuser during his prosecution. And I'll just say no, it was my uncle. And during his trial, I asked that the letter be read. And I don't know word for word by any means, but I believe the general direction of the letter was that I strongly desired for, if there happened to be any other children in his life, that they would be protected. But the biggest desire I had was that he would be able to ask the Lord for forgiveness. Side trail again. One of my cousins passed away a couple years after my uncle was prosecuted. And after his funeral, there was a small get-together type of thing. And my uncle was there. It was the first time I'd seen him since then. And he kind of waved me over, asked permission to talk to me. And I thought that was honorable. So I talked to him, and the first thing out of his mouth was, would I forgive him? And I said, yes. And he wanted to let me know that because of the prosecution and the letter I'd written, that he'd given his life to the Lord. And that was the first person I'd led to the Lord. So that was really cool. Kind of overwhelming. I didn't really, kind of nodded my head and walked away, and that was that. But looking back, it was pretty awesome. But, so that stuff came up during my week at the SALT conference, and they had asked me to write a letter. So I went back to my room, and I said to myself, I don't want to write a letter. But interesting thing, earlier that day, one of the guest speakers at the end of her talk, I don't remember the talk at all, but this one thing she said, have you ever gotten mad at God? And I was like, well, that's weird. She said, have you ever gotten mad at God? If you haven't, you should give it a try, because I guarantee you he can take it. And I smiled a little bit, and I just, I forgot about it in the moment, because it didn't really match the rest of her talk, and her talk was great. And most of these talks, they pertained to some type of abuse, generally some type of sexual abuse or emotional abuse, childhood abuse. But when I went back to my room, those words kept popping into my head. And I did one of those lay on your face, ugly cry, praying to God kind of things, and I got really mad at God. And I thought of some moments. I thought of a moment before anything had happened with my uncle. I thought of a moment when a neighborhood boy had taken advantage of me. You know, my dad wasn't home. We lived in this trailer out in the woods, just down the road from a trailer park. And I guess just needing any kind of attention, I just didn't say no. I didn't object. You know, very much a victim, but again, there's a lot of psychological stuff going on. But I thought of that moment, and I thought, where were you at, Lord, when that was going on? Why did you let that happen? Why on earth would you allow someone to hurt such a young boy that was so vulnerable and had no one to protect him? I was pissed off at God. And I wrote him a letter. Brought it back to my group, and I read it to the group. And then I broke through all that garbage, and then I showed some emotion. And it seemed like it was a bit more emotion than they were used to seeing. Because, you know, oh yeah, I brought my paper towels because real men don't use Kleenex. Take a note, guys. Yeah, I don't think they were used to seeing that kind of emotion, so most of them, you know, you get a few words here and there, but yeah, it felt good. It really did to one, discover that a lot of the roots of my fear were the fact that I just didn't feel protected. And for so many years, the way I dealt with things was based on wanting to protect myself. The way I reacted to anything, emotionless, because emotions were dangerous. So later that night, just my small group, we went down to Lake Michigan. So this place was a beautiful setting, was on Lake Michigan. And we started a fire in a little bonfire deal on the lake. And we had written something down and burned it in the fire. I'm sure a lot of small places do that. But it carries a lot of significance. We were asked to write down a lie about ourselves that we had believed. And the act of burning it in a fire was saying that we don't believe this curse about ourselves anymore. The lie I wrote down that I had believed was that my feelings don't matter. And the truth is, for years, I did not believe that my feelings mattered. If something happened that would normally hurt someone's feelings, it didn't bother me. If something happened that most people laughed at, I would say that's not funny, or just not laugh. And the things I did laugh at were generally cruel things, or when people fell and hurt themselves, and sick sense of humor, not God-honoring. And there's still a touch of that, I'll be honest. But, man, I'm a daddy now, and it's such a blessing. And my wife is such a sweetheart, and God is changing me, and it's beautiful. But I'm getting off track, and I apologize. But I wanted to share more of me and the story, and it really does add to the depth of how I got my name, Pastor Fun. So I threw that curse in the fire. I burned it. And here's the cool thing. So the next day, they said, hey, we're going to do some baptisms at lunchtime. And I'd been baptized before at 12 years old. And we're talking, I don't know, 20 years later? Yeah, just about 20 years later. I was in my early, mid-30s, something like that. And for me, symbolically, and by the way, there's no word for word instruction on what baptism is and looks like in Scripture. And if you want to get right down to it, it's actually it's borrowed from paganism. Yes, Jesus was baptized, but that's a whole other conversation, and I don't mind covering that in another video. I have about 30 ideas, and I will actually be preaching some, but that's not really what we're doing right now. But I got baptized, and as some people may think, when you go under the water, that's your old self dying. When you come out of the water, that's your new self rising. That's very basic summary. It means a lot of other things as well. I don't want to take that away from anyone. But for me, on that day, so yes, I agreed to get baptized, and I did. When I got baptized, the lies I believed about myself, that victim, that person who wasn't good enough for anything, not even good enough to stand up for himself, not even good enough to be loved by God, to be defended by God, went under the water. And you can see Pastor Fun came up, but that's not quite the moment when I got that name. But the new creation came up. The new creation being the person who rejected those lies and believed in my God-given identity, because although I knew what Scripture said about me, I definitely wasn't believing that, and I definitely wasn't walking in that truth. A little later that day, one of the two facilitators from that group, he kind of gave a little speech about the various people in the Bible who had been renamed and the significance behind their renaming. And he got a little teary-eyed, but they all knew I was a youth pastor, and they knew the baggage that I came in with, and how much lighter my step was towards the end of the week. And he renamed me Pastor Fun. And that is why I have that title now, and it's no official anything, but that's my online identity for this YouTube channel. It's my Instagram page name. I feel like I want to go back really quick. The letter I wrote to God, and I'm only going back because I really want to make sure God gets the glory in all of this. My question was, where was God during all that? When I asked him that question, his answer was that he was right there. And initially that really angered me. But he revealed to me that he was right there. Mourning. He was hurting because I was hurting. was hurting for me in ways that I didn't even know I heard yet. Our free will really is a beautiful thing, but evil's a powerful thing too. So we need to do our best with the gift that God has given us. And I hope in sharing this that someone that maybe had anything remotely similar happen in their lives will know that where you're at doesn't have to be the end. I haven't arrived yet by any means, but I will say that it gets better. And God is faithful, even when we're not. I've been unfaithful to God a lot. And He's never once turned His back on me. So, don't want to take away from anything else that I might have to talk about in the future. So, I have ideas for some messages about hope and putting our hope in the wrong things. I have messages about discipling. I have messages about obedience, about our church and what's wrong with it. I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts. Go ahead and subscribe. That'd be great. And leave some ideas for messages you might want to hear in the comments. And I'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks.